thank you so much for joining us for this event today to celebrate Alejandra Campoverdi and her national best-selling memoir, First Gen. How many of you have the book? And she'll be available to sign books, and we will also have somebody here to sell books if you'd like to purchase the book after the event. But I'm Jody Aegis Vallejo. I'm a professor of sociology here at USC and also associate director of the USC Equity Research Institute, which we refer to as ERI. And at ERI, we produce data-driven analysis and rigorous research that leads to social change. And really our tagline is data analysis to power social change. And before we start, I just want to take a moment for a land acknowledgement and to recognize that California is home to Native nations on whose land we live, that USC is located on Tonga land. We want to challenge the inaccurate narrative that the state was built by immigrants. Immigrants certainly helped to build this state, but we want to acknowledge the land we reside on was taken by a settler colonial society that exploited Native immigrant, migrant, and enslaved people, stealing labor, knowledge, and skills to build what we now call the state of California. And as we recognize this history, we have to also grapple with what it means to live on stolen land. We have to understand our role and responsibilities as guests on Native American homelands and be committed to supporting the struggle for Native nation sovereignty and self-determination. And so I just want to take a minute to settle in, get ready for this talk today. Just take one big, deep, intentional breath with me. And first I want to thank our co-sponsors, so the Department of Sociology here at USC, the First Generation Plus Success Center, the USC First Generation Student Assembly, and the USC Office of Religious and Spiritual Life. So thank you so much for supporting us. A big shout out to my sociology class, Immigrant America. Give me a shout if you're in my class. And I'm just so pleased and honored that we are having this conversation today about this book. You know, this book does something so profoundly important. It complicates the idea of the American dream, this idea of American meritocracy that so many of us are socialized into. It obscures that this myth of meritocracy really obscures the deep inequalities that are pervasive in our systems, these kinds of inequalities that shape not only our economic mobility, but also our sense of belonging, how we see ourselves in relation to others, and how others see us. And this book is especially meaningful to me because I study social mobility. I study the mobility of people into the middle and upper classes with a special focus on Latinos, really the trailblazers who live a life across multiple spaces of race and class and wealth that can often feel worlds apart from each other. And so as a first generation college student myself, I'm the first in my family to go to college, to graduate from college, the only one in my family who has a PhD or a graduate degree, someone who has grown up really experiencing so many of the things that are written about in this book. It was so personal to read this book. I recognized myself in so many of Alejandra's stories. You know, the perfectionism born out of generational inheritances, the push and pull between pride and pressure, the gratitude you feel to where you come from, but also the weight of belonging, the constant work of belonging, and really the generational aspirations that you carry, that you're born out of. And so one of the things, a line in this book that was so powerful was this line that, you know, Alejandra wrote this book to help us reclaim the parts of ourselves we sacrifice in order to survive. And I think that's something that I'll never forget. So I'm really pleased to introduce our author, Alejandra Campoverdi. She's a nationally recognized advocate for educational opportunity and women's health, a best-selling author, former White House aide to President Obama. In 2024, she founded the First Gen Fund. It's a 501c3 that provides hardship grants directly to First Gen students. And she's also produced groundbreaking PBS health documentary called Inheritance, and she holds a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and graduated cum laude right here from USC. Very much a homecoming for her. And currently she's a senior fellow at the USC Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy. And then I'd also like to introduce our moderator, Manuel Pastor, a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity, and director of the Equity Research Institute here at USC. Professor Pastor holds an economics PhD. We still like him, even though he's got a PhD in economics, from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and is the inaugural holder of the Terpanchian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change at USC. So please help me welcome Alejandra and Professor Pastor to our stage here.
Hello. Am I on? Hello. Can you hear me? Great. Before we get started, can I thank everyone?
Please.
Because this is very special. As Jody mentioned, this is I graduated from here, but this is the first time I have ever spoken at USC, which is wild considering the book came out almost 2.5 years ago. So this is a really special conversation. I want to thank Manuel, obviously, who was the person who put this together with so much love and so much intentionality, and the whole ERI staff, Jody, of course, all of you, and all of our co-sponsors, because I'm an Annenberg grad. I know they were part of this, the First Gen Student Center, and I know I'm forgetting a bunch, Religious Life, Student Affairs?
I think so, yeah.
Yes. Thank you all. This is a very special day, and as you could tell, this is a conversation. So I hope if you have any questions, you will save them, because I like to say I'm not the expert on being a first and only. We all are, and so the point isn't for me to be here and lecture anyone so much as all of us to have a conversation. So thank you again for having me.
Well, I can't tell you how delighted I am that this day is finally here. Alejandra and I met, I think, a couple of years ago, and then we've had both a couple of lunches together, and also I did a deep read of the book. And I would say from the moment I met you, the thing that keeps resonating for me is I knew I would like you, I didn't know how much. And in particular, after reading this book, which I think speaks so deeply to this experience of being first and only. First gen is part of it, but first and only in a more dramatic way. I mean, I felt that because I like to say I'm also first gen high school. That was the first generation to actually complete high school. And sometimes when you see us up here in fancy clothes and titles and master's degrees from Harvard, you may know where we're headed, but you don't always know where we came from and what that story is. And it's so powerful, this book, because you reveal all that. And I want to talk more about that, but I want to start with something we have in common, which is writing. And I want to ask you, why write? Why use this as a way to talk to people?
Well, my answer is a story, surprise, surprise. But I actually want to take a quick survey. How many people in the room have read the book? Is it like half and half? Okay, it looks like we're about half and half. So if you'll indulge me, for those that have read the book, my answer is a part of the book, and I'll go quickly to not be redundant, which is, when I was around 11, 12 years old, it was a really difficult time at home. My mom had just gotten out of an emotionally abusive relationship and had a newborn and was really trying to keep her head above water, and I was kind of on my own. And she did what a lot of parents do and wanted to put me someplace where someone could help me kind of get through this time. And she found a nonprofit, and it was an arts nonprofit, one of these great nonprofits in LA that use writing and acting and all of this in order to kind of help you find your voice, even though we thought we were like in a class, right? We thought we were in a fun after school program. So in this class, they went and they put a pen in our hands one day and they said, "You're gonna write a play." And all we had ever written, I don't know about you all at that age, was kind of regurgitating book reports and so on. But all of us said, okay, and I said, write about what you know. So you can imagine what we knew was pretty adult at those ages. And so we didn't write about Care Bears. And if you think about it, my play, the main character was nothingness. The personification of darkness and depression was my main character at 12. in conversation with a woman who had just gotten out of an emotionally abusive relationship. I mean, you see how you're just channeling this, especially when you don't have access to therapy as a child or you don't talk about these taboo subjects, right? So that worked its way into my play that I thought was very anonymous and fictionalized. And because it was Los Angeles, there were professional writers and actors who would volunteer to put our plays on at UCLA. Am I allowed to say the name of that school here? No. So they donate a small theater there at UCLA. And the woman who had been chosen to play Nothingness in my play had just come off of doing the film What's Love Got to Do with It, with Angela Bassett, you know, the Tina Turner biopic. So she had played an Ikette in this movie. She did an incredible job, and afterwards, I'm walking through the audience, and as you can imagine, again, I'm a kid, I'm 11, 12 years old. I'm walking through the audience, and I feel a tap on my shoulder, and I turn around, and it's Angela Bassett. I could feel the energy shift I felt in the room is how I felt when I saw her. I was like, oh, right, and just radiant. And she says, you know, I just wanted to tell you, it was some variation of, you know, when I saw your play, I really personally identified with it. And it really struck me as a kid, because I couldn't have articulated this at that point, but it really struck me that what I thought was very personal, unique pain to me was actually something that other people might relate to, and somehow that made me feel a little less alone. Maybe it felt that made that person feel a little less alone, but I realized that that very personal feeling pain could be alchemized into this connective tissue if I was willing to share it. Again, I could not have said that at the time, but I realized that that actually helped me get through very painful moments throughout the rest of my life. And if you read the book, you know there were many, and for all of us, you know, it continues on facing these moments that were challenged. But writing became this beautiful, alchemizing, connective tissue, and it still is. I mean, look at this room and the folks that I've gotten to meet already, and I've been to over 100 colleges now in 2 years and some change, right? And we're everywhere, first and onlys. Those of us that share this emotional experience, and even those that don't consider themselves first and onlys, we're everywhere. And that connective tissue is right there, right, if we're willing to be vulnerable.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that is, you actually come back to it at the end of the book, and there's a quote, I'm going to try to remember it, that vulnerability is how we transform pain into emotional connection. And it was really striking to me. I shared with you that I came from a family where there was domestic violence, and learning to operate in that pain, learning to operate with vulnerability, learning to talk about it in public and take the taboo off it so that other people who might have had that be part of their experience feel like they're seen in the room. I mean, it seems to me like that's a big part of this book, is that you're exceptionally vulnerable. You talk about the traumas of your family and the generations of women. You talk about the trauma of coming to USC and feeling out of place.
Does anyone relate to that at all? No? Okay, I see a lot of hands and nodding.
Might be a few. But, you know, then we can talk more about, I really want to talk even more about it, but how do we take, there's like a level of coming to peace so that you can actually be vulnerable and transform that pain to emotional connection.
Well, I don't want to be Pollyanna about it, because, you know, the first line of the book is, I'm going to keep it real with you, and that's my commitment always. And that wasn't born of me embarking on this beautiful healing journey and like meditating under a tree. Usually we know what helps us to embark or pushes us to embark on these kind of journeys of understanding how we move through pain is pain. Right, is kind of getting to this point where the coping mechanisms you may have created to survive, sometimes as children, sometimes as adults, just don't work anymore. It doesn't keep it down anymore, right? And you know, I write about in the book how at the very beginning of this journey, I started thinking about this by speaking to you all. And so before I even wrote this book, I would always go and speak at different colleges. It was important to me, like I'm sure for the educators in the room, or hopefully for those of you who are students, after you make it out the other side of the sausage maker, you kind of want to go and mark the trees for younger versions of yourself, right? I don't know if you guys feel kind of compelled to seek out those young people. And I did too, and I would get introduced with a bio like the one that was just read. And it would go through these bullet points that sounded so glossy and so obvious and so linear. And I was struck by the fact that that's not what happened, right? And yes, I did those things, but the spaces between those bullet points was actually the real story. And if I was willing to share them, what would that look like? Because I would look out at the audience, and like I can kind of see in some of your faces, because part of being parentified as a child is you get really good at reading rooms. And it's a benefit, right? Because you're a really good professional, you're really good at, reading nonverbal communication, but you realize it comes out of looking for a sense of safety, right? Comes out of making sure you're safe in spaces and kind of clocking who's nodding, who doesn't get what, who's maybe on the fence about what I'm saying. Like, I've already kind of looked at this room 5 times. I know where everyone's sitting and so on, right? That can be a positive, but where was it born from, right? So all that to say is I would sit there and I would look out at you all and I would see a look in your eyes that was very similar to mine. And that was, yeah, pride. And you should feel it, guys. You're at USC. This is not a small feat that you're here, right? You should feel pride. But I also felt some melancholy. I also felt some guilt. I also felt some not so easy to point to emotions of kind of feeling neither here nor there. Like, there was a lot of other things, and it wasn't all imposter syndrome. And you know that I have a lot to say about that topic, right? It wasn't all that. It was too neat to kind of sweep it into that one box and say, okay, it's all imposter syndrome. No, it wasn't. So what was that? So I started talking about it the way I'm talking about now, way before the book, and I started saying, well, you heard I went to USC. Did you hear I had a panic attack in front of Tommy Trojan on my first day of orientation? You heard I went to Harvard. Did you hear I took out 6 figures of student loan debt in order to go? You heard I worked at the White House. Did you know I had to live off my credit card and with no health care in someone's basement in order to be able to work on the campaign, which is how I got to the White House, right? Left out of the story. Relevant information, right? So those experiences that I white-knuckled my way through, those painful experiences that I white-knuckled my way through, eventually you get all the things on your resume. I have no doubt that everyone in this entire room is going to get what they are after, right? This is not a shy, untalented room. And, like was quoted in the beginning, do you want to reclaim the things that you might have sacrificed in order to survive? How important is that in order to break all the cycles? Because if cycle breaking only involves graduating from college or being the first in your family to have a professional job or buy a house, is that a complete cycle break? Does cycle breaking also include being the first in your family to not be in fight or flight mode? Does cycle breaking also include being the first in your family to not be in survival energy? I'd say those are equally as important. And so, again, I have a lot to say, and I'll stop there around overachieving and all of that piece, not to take away from anyone's accomplishment, right? This is complicated. And to me, it's not depressing. If you haven't read the book, for those that have, you can tell them, you're not going to finish this book and be like, oh, well, boy, I'm screwed. That's not the message in the book. And as I write, you can't heal from the things you don't name.
Now, when you finish the book, mostly you're thinking, I wonder what happened to that guy's spider. But, well, we won't get to that. But, I really want to pick up on something you said. You talk about accomplishments and then marking the trees, which made me think of dogs pissing on their territory. But I think sometimes what happens is people mark the trees and then se creen muy muy. That is, if you know Spanish, it means that someone's very conceited. It's literally, if you don't know Spanish.
They think you're all that. That's what I think it translates directly to you think you're all that.
That's right. It actually translates literally as he believes himself to be very, very, which I think is such a great expression. But how do you accomplish and overcome obstacles and then not wind up getting trapped in the ego of that success, of being able to understand and go back to the struggles and the hurt, and being thoughtful about the doors you're supposed to be opening rather than the platforms that you want to be heralded on?
It's such a good question, and there's so many layers to that answer. Well, number one is that we were talking about those bios and how you're all going to have those bios, and at a certain point, it will be up to you to smash them a bit, right? Because you will be reduced to your accomplishments, and yes, people will do that, but are we going to do that? Are we going to allow ourselves to be seen that way because we want credit? Or we want to be seen as maybe like we had it all figured out, or we were the smarter ones, or we were the exceptional ones, right? I personally never found that very inspiring when people would come sit in front of me when I was in school and try to motivate me by telling me how perfect they were, right? The people I find the most interesting and dynamic are usually complicated, right? They have these contradictions, they have these parts of them that, again, don't necessarily mean that they have to be contradictory. There is nothing contradictory about being in one place and coming to another, right? And ending up in another. But sometimes we're made to feel that these things don't match. They're mismatched puzzle pieces. Do we have to buy into that narrative? Because I was sharing with Manuel, I was driving down here, down the 10 like I used to as a freshman, listening to K-Day, right? That was 17-year-old me. That will always be 17-year-old me. People will tell me, they'll be like, well, you know, what would you tell 16-year-old Alejandra who was riding around in stolen cars with her gangster boyfriend? I'm like, she's right here. You want me to put her down? I'm not going to put her down. You know, she's the reason why I'm here. These things can coexist, right? We might feel that we have to lose these parts of ourselves. And it's funny because, God, I have so many memories walking through this campus and the messages I got, not only from outside groups, but from my own groups about what it looked like to perform my identity in a way that was acceptable to everyone else, right? Sometimes the calls come from inside the house, right? So how do you handle that? Because that vulnerability, I don't know about you all, but when I share those things with you, do you see me as weak? I don't think that makes people sound weak, right? When I see someone who's kind of putting on airs and pretending like everything was easy, when you know it wasn't, and it wasn't helping anyone to make it seem that way, that's where I have a little side eye, right? So I think that, you know, when we're talking about marking the trees, being honest about your experience is the most important part. And that's always been my commitment and why I wrote the book that I did, and why people tell me, well, you were so vulnerable, do you feel exposed? Some of us get to the point where we haven't been telling the truth to others and to ourselves for so long that not telling the truth is actually the most painful part. Telling the truth, owning what happened, being honest with ourselves, with everyone else about who we really are, and all those jagged edges, which are actually, like I said, I think so dynamic and beautiful, that's when we come into our real power. And that is when we might scare some people. And again, not your problem.
You know, there's an interesting lesson there in understanding that safety can come in being exposed. That was for the LGBTQ movement coming out, for the dreamers coming out. Hard for you to hurt me once you already know that I'm undocumented.
Well, perfect example, if you allow me to interject for a second. Who's seen 8 Mile? I can't be that old. You guys have seen 8 Mile. Okay, great. What's the best moment in the entire rap battle? Think of this in those moments for yourself.
Yes.
It's when Eminem comes out. How does he smash him at the very end? He says and owns everything about himself. And he was like, tell them something they don't know about me. Right? That is the Chill's end moment where the guy is speechless. The more you own all of these things, the less you're controlled by the opinion of others.
And I was struck by, I had this experience recently as the raids broke in Los Angeles. I found myself on the streets with people who were doing cat and dog fights with police, and then through a series of demonstrations. But the one group that was actually able to take the steps of the federal building was a group of faith leaders who walked up completely exposed. Mm. And so there's analogies between this personal thing about being exposed and finding safety in it, and then what we can do politically. I want you, you mentioned it. Talk a little bit about imposter syndrome, Hugo Imposter Syndrome Plus. I mean, I know what that feels like. When I was in high school, I wasn't slated to go to college. When I was in college, I wasn't slated to go to graduate school. When I went to graduate school, they said, you'll never end up at a major university. Here I fucking am.
Yes.
So there's part of it along the way. I know I've felt both an imposter, but also at some sense, like these rules must be wrong because I know I belong here. So there must be something wrong with the system that's trying to make me feel less than. Can you talk about how you talk about that?
I will. Thank you for bringing that up. I was introduced to imposter syndrome, like many of us are, and it's pretty well-meaning, right? The idea that, again, when I was a child, you may feel this thing, it's called imposter syndrome, when you're in these spaces and you realize you're the only person, or there's no one else that might look like you or come from where you come from, and just remind yourself that you belong there, right? And be confident, and talk yourself up. And I would do that as I got older, when I would feel different things that didn't feel great, and I would pump myself up before I walked into these classrooms, into these boardrooms. And then I'd notice that I might notice some dynamics in the room. Maybe everyone was coming from an office together. Maybe everyone was talking about a point of reference that I didn't know. Whatever that dynamic was, sometimes it was completely nonverbal. I would just pick up on body language. Maybe I would say something and it wouldn't be acknowledged, and then people would clap when the person next to me would say the same thing, right? Things would just happen, and it didn't feel good. I felt some type of way about it. Is that imposter syndrome? No, guys. That's called being emotionally intelligent and perceptive, right? Because sometimes there are dynamics. Sometimes there are social hierarchies. Sometimes there are these dynamics that us noticing doesn't mean that we're insecure. Pathologizing us noticing dynamics in rooms where we might be a first or an only, for that to become something we then go home and bludgeon ourselves with and tell ourselves how insecure we are, it doesn't sit right with me. Because that doesn't mean you can't lead in that space. It doesn't mean you can't be the person who changes that space. And that awareness, if anything, if you clock it, right, maybe you could be more strategic how you move there. Maybe you can think about, what it is, the purpose that you're in that room, right? But that awareness alone, even if it feels bad, is not a bad thing. And certainly not something to beat yourself up about, right? And so it didn't sit right with me to see that become yet another way that we were kind of taking a natural to be expected feeling and kind of sweeping it into a self-focused way to beat ourselves up. Because I don't know about you all, but first and onlys, however you might identify, you guys aren't insecure people. Let me tell you, to be the first in your family to pursue something like college or a professional career or all the different things that you might be a first to do, a major you love and are passionate about versus a major that you might have been expected to do, whatever that question is for you, that is a gutsy, courageous thing to do. To put yourself in schools and institutions like this one that might sometimes feel like they weren't made for you, that's a super gutsy, courageous thing to do. You all are courageous people. Don't tell yourself you're insecure constantly. I would bet on this crew more than anyone else, right? I always say it was harder for me to get from my childhood to USC, to college, than it was to get from USC to the White House. Let me say that again. It was harder for me to get from my childhood to USC than from USC to the White House. Why? You all don't realize how many off-ramps you've already passed. You don't realize how many things you've white-knuckled it through and how many skills, frankly, that will help you do all the things you want to do that you've already amassed in your belt, right? So do me a favor, and next time you walk into these rooms, and it feels bad because it will feel bad because it does feel bad. I'm not sweeping that under the rug, but when you feel it, clock it. Like, what is this feeling telling me? What am I noticing because I'm wise, right? What am I noticing? And now that I know this thing, that I've noticed this thing, how am I going to show up? That is what I think.
That is a great understanding, and it's one you came to a bit later.
Yeah.
Because early on in the book, there's, you talk about gobbling up accomplishments. And gobbling up accomplishments is what we do when we feel like, well, I don't really belong here, so I'm just going to gobble up as much as possible. And if my CV is super long, maybe I really do belong. And I'm sure some of our young students in the room are in that space of gobbling up accomplishments and not letting ourselves off the hook to, or whatever phrase you would use, to experience love, experience life, experience self-care. Just take care.
Well, first I want to lead with saying, if everyone here isn't on their healing journey at 17, 18 years old, that's totally fine. Okay, it took me a really long time to kind of cobble together all these thoughts that over many years I put into this one book, hoping if it could save you 5 minutes, let alone 5 months, let alone 5 years, I'd be a happy camper, right? So I just want to lead with that. You can't go from being an overachiever with professional educational achievements and then become a healing overachiever, right? So just be careful with that. But what I was going to say is that, I talk about in the book, for those that haven't read it, when I kind of started behaving that way, and it took me a while, to your point, to clock that in myself and kind of own that. But when all this was going on around that time of that nonprofit, and I got to high school, and I was in high school in the 90s in LA, and you remember those times, I owned my culture, my identity, all of that in my sleeve and my clothes, like in my music, like it was something that was a part of me, right? But I was also looking for things to break myself against. And what I decided I was going to break myself against, because I was very angry. If anyone remembers being very angry in high school, I was there with you. And I was like, okay, well, let's go find this boyfriend who, back then we had pagers, guys. I know, I'm that old. Who is just gonna do this hot and cold thing to just revisit and reimagine the same hot and cold chaotic energy that I had in my family and with my caretakers, right? So I went and I found a perfect replica of that. And guess what? The more that this guy put me through hell, the higher my grades would go. The more I would go drinking on the weekends, sorry mom, she's back there. The more I'd go drinking on the weekends to the beach, I became class president, right? There was this kind of inversely related way that I made myself a really good college applicant by finding ways to make it through trauma by overachieving and being a perfectionist. Now, I could not have said that even probably 10 years ago, right? But now I look back, and in going through this process of writing this book, I realized how it was a way that I felt a sense of control, right? It was a way that I felt a sense of accomplishment, that I would get a pat on the back every once in a while, that I would feel seen sometimes in a family that I didn't feel like I belonged in sometimes, because I wanted different things, because I moved differently, right? So I did those things. But on paper, again, we're all about on paper versus in reality. I was class president, homecoming queen, leading the school musicals, math club, all the different things, as I was having increasing panic attacks, right? And becoming increasingly agoraphobic, which is when you kind of start not wanting to leave your house because you're so scared. And I didn't know what these things were called. I didn't know it was called a panic attack. I just knew that sometimes I would get so scared, I would feel like I was gonna die. And I didn't want that to happen in public. So I started shrinking my world. By the way, you got into USC, great. By the time it was time to come to this campus in '97, right? I forced my mom to come with my baby sister in a little running stroller to freshman orientation with me because I was so afraid this thing would happen to me. And I don't know how many people might relate to it. I talk a lot about it in the book, to feeling like not only is your future dependent on getting everything right and being perfect as that overachiever in these 4 years, but your family's future is hinging on that too, right? All the people that depend on you, to not leave empty-handed. I hear it from students all the time, I can't leave college empty-handed, right? Whatever that means. And so that pressure, as you can imagine, the Trojan marching band is going, right? I'm in Bovard, right? It's Bovard still, where they do freshman orientation? I'm in Bovard, it's all going. You remember that moment, I'm sure. And all I could hear was a pitching, screeching noise in my ears, and I knew what was happening. I started blacking out, and I ran out the front doors and passed out under Tommy Trojan very dramatically. Now, what happened after that? Again, I'll pause the story there for time's sake, but I ended up at the health center. I ended up with a prescription for sedatives, and again, well-meaningly, but trying to get me to be able to survive a time when taking midterms meant I had to take Xanax. Right? I write about it in the book. So this is not to take away from the accomplishment of being an overachiever. We're not making your overachieving, your perfectionism, or I should say your accomplishment. I'm not trivializing it and making it all about trauma. It is incredible what folks in this room have accomplished. But there's a tipping point. And the tipping point is the come from. To your point, what's the come from? Is the come from, I'm passionate about this drives me, this is what my life's purpose is, this is what I want to do, and I'm gonna choose to do this. I'm gonna join this club, I'm gonna take this internship, I'm gonna take this risk, because this is what lights me up? Or, if we're honest with ourselves, is it, this is a way to kind of feed that part of myself, right? And finding that line is really important because, again, we all need resume stuff. And guys, I am just as achievement-oriented and ambitious as I've always been. That hasn't changed. You don't have to sacrifice your ambition and your achievements in order to be a balanced, integrated person. But recognizing where that line is for all of us, God, I wish I understood that sooner in my life. I would have saved myself a lot of burnout, right?
Yeah, there's a great line in the book. It's about your family, that chaos was our glue. And I think that sometimes our sort of overreaction to it is that control is the way to stop that chaos, instead of somehow actually finding your way to peace and balance. And I'm so glad that you've been on this journey. I want to...
It's a lifelong journey, guys. Okay, like I said in the beginning, I'm not up here as everything is fine. People ask me all the time, well, how do you not feel breakaway guilt? How do you not feel like, how do you not get into this parentification patterns? How do you, and again, I never want to take credit for something that is a lifelong journey for all of us as humans, right? But we can learn to call ourselves on it. We can learn tools, we can understand what's going on, but thank you, I appreciate that. But this stuff, I can tell you stories from last week of some of this stuff coming up for me, so.
Yeah, I think that's important to remember, that it is a journey and not an end point. I want to ask you two more questions before opening it up to the audience.
Okay, I'm going to try to be short so that we have plenty of time for you all to ask your questions.
Take your time. The first is, I was struck by first and only as a concept, and it made me think, I talked to you about this, what's it mean to embrace first and many? That is, first and only can be, I was the first one through, here's some lessons, I'm pretty special. First and many is, what's my responsibility to open doors? What are my mechanisms for opening doors, for creating, and I think this because I'm older than you, and I'm thinking a lot more about mentoring, about the next generation, about what it means for the many.
No, I think it's an important question, and you all know why I wanted to broaden this, because this was a topic and an emotional journey that I saw was beyond race, beyond gender, beyond geography. I mean, I've spoken everywhere from Alaska to El Paso to rural Minnesota. You know, I've spoken to all kinds of groups, and so I was very intentional about using the term first and only. But it's interesting, because I'm going to give you a complicated answer, because if you haven't noticed, I kind of like complicated. But, you know, first and only to first and many. I'd say that this community, and I've spent a lot of time with this community, not only as someone who has visited all these colleges, but also as somebody who has a nonprofit where this year received thousands of applications from first-gen students sharing their story, sharing how they feel around these different dynamics, right? and reading each of these myself, right? We even have one of our fellow winners here. And what struck me is this community, I'm not worried about this community being all about themselves. It actually might be quite the opposite. Because over and over and over again, what I'd hear is, I'm skipping meals in order to send my parents money for their rent. I'm not doing internships in order to work all year so that I can contribute to this for my family or that for my family, right? This idea that while you're still dog paddling as that first and only to make it yourself, you're gonna put somebody on your back too. Put many people on your back. Well, what happens when you're in a pool and you're dog paddling and people jump on your back? Do you both drown? Okay. So when I think about this topic, I think about how can we support the first and onlys to get that solid footing, because they're focused on so many other people, sometimes to the detriment of their own mental health, their own capacity to graduate, their own capacity to have financial stability on their own, to then help the people that they love. I'm not saying don't help, absolutely. We should be first in very many, right? But it is not selfish for first and onlys to get their heads above water first, right? And to feel resourced, right? And to integrate all of these experiences and find ways to take those risks themselves, even if they're being dissuaded, even if they're being told, why'd you go to that fancy, expensive school to go take that kind of job? That sounds dumb. Why'd you go to that fancy, expensive school to do an unpaid internship? What are you thinking? And
if you've read the book, she made a lot of dumb decisions along the way. That exactly.
Oh, I
Square
own
with that.
them. I own them. I think we've gotten there. And so when those dumb decisions, but that end up connecting to something that you know is a right choice in the long run, to be able to help, to be able to be first in many. You know how many 17-year-olds I talk to, 18-year-olds who are like, okay, I need to start a nonprofit to help everyone who's been in my shoes. Girl or guy, get solid footing. You're going to have lots of time to help everyone, but you are telling me that you can't afford to eat 3 meals a day, right? So if no one tells you, let me be the one to tell you that it's not selfish right now to focus on getting there, right? Because you will create those openings for everyone. You will create the capacity, like I did once I started having solid footing, to create nonprofits, to share what you've learned. But not if you burn yourself out thinking that you're being selfish. There's a fine line here. Does that make sense? Okay.
So one last question for me, and then I'll turn things to Jody, see if she's got a question. She will also, I think, run a mic around the room to pick up student questions. Alejandra, what should I have asked you that I did not?
Well, first of all, I think it's safe to say these are some of the best questions I've received, not just because you're you and I'm here, but I think that, well, first of all, I'm media trained, so I'm going to answer the way I want to answer anyway.
I knew that.
I worked at the White House in comms, guys, right? I'm going to give the answers I want to give. No. I think that the only other question that I would have asked, and maybe someone else would have asked it, is, what is the kind of message, like the biggest message that I hope that you all take from this book, and maybe even from this conversation? So I guess I'll say that.
Alejandra, what is the big message that you hope that this audience takes away from this conversation, and those who have read the book take away from the book?
What a wonderful question.
Yes, I thought so.
My message is, for those of you who identify with this, again, whether or not you walked in the room thinking that you're a first and only, or you're just realizing now that maybe you identify with some of it, I want you to know that first and onlys are very special souls. And if you don't believe in souls, insert whatever word you want to put in there, right? But I want you to let in what kind of person comes into a bloodline, comes into a family structure, and is the one that takes the more difficult route and disrupts it, sometimes with a lack of curiosity of the folks around them, sometimes with active resistance, right? To be that person, that's not a lack person. That's a person that comes with a lot of wisdom, inherently, and intuition, And that intuition, that is the reason why you keep doing the things you're doing, because no one's forcing you to be here. No one's I mean, maybe you're getting some extra credit by being here today, but you know what I mean. No one's forcing you to be in this institution and to keep going against these headwinds, right? Why are you doing it? Is it something in you? Is it something you feel you can't put words into? Many times it is, right? That is your wisdom, your intuition, your inner compass. And that is why I dropped out of my grad program. That is why I took on very strategic debt. That's why I made a lot of the choices that you see worked out, but that were maybe pretty irrational sounding in the moment. And so own that, feel pride about that, right? Feel pride about this identity, because you should. And honing that part of you is one of the biggest, not only professional, but personal strengths that you can devote some time to right now.
I knew I like you. I just didn't know how much. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Thank you. And him.
And Jody will solicit questions, but also, Jody, please feel free to ask the first question yourself. I know you were so moved by this book.
Well, you already stole my first question when you asked about Spider. Can you explain Spider and the significance of that time in your life? You touched on it a little bit, but I think there's always this idea that you have to be perfect. You have to be the one that exudes perfection, you know, have the perfect boyfriend, the perfect life. Yet you were really able to explore yourself in a lot of different ways, and here you still are. So tell us a little bit more about kind of some of some of the moments that happened to you that are still hidden, that maybe some people don't know or understand about.
Well, what I'll say about
that
Spider.
people think could have knocked you off your path, but also didn't.
Well, what I'll say about Spider, since you brought it up, is, you know, the reason people have asked why that was, there's only one romantic relationship I talk about in the book, and that was intentional, and it was, for those who haven't read it, it was this young man, Spider. And the reason why I included that particular one was because for many of us, I don't know any of you all, sometimes there's this one relationship, usually in our adolescent years, that is not just about a love relationship, right? It's all wrapped up with identity. It's all wrapped up with where we come from and where we're going and who we think we are, who we want to be, the pieces of ourselves that we told may not fit. And that's what he was for me. You know, he was this pivotal relationship, or he was, you know, in Dumbo, he has a magic feather. He was like that magic feather, and I really wanted to hold on to him because I felt safer with him, right? Now, was it because, you know, he was doing some not so great things out in the world? Sure, but I felt like, okay, I felt protected, right? And so when I lost him, and I won't give it away, but when I lost him in a pretty sudden way right before, the summer before I got to USC, and basically you took the snow globe of my life, turned it upside down and shook it, right? In the book, I say, you know, the soundtrack of my life went from Dr. Dre to Dave Matthews over one summer, because that's what happened, right? When I got to USC in '97 in the fall, I mean, that next year, the year after, is when they shot the movie Legally Blonde on campus, right? Like literally, like right here, like on Truesdale. And so you can imagine the juxtaposition of these two times and what it is that I did to survive in these spaces. And again, there's a whole chapter on my experience basically in the Greek system here at USC, right? And I won't go too long because I really want to open this up to your questions, but that's why I included it. But to the earlier point, that's why when I go and speak at high-rise law firms in New York, I talk about it just as openly as I talk about it here, because that's also the part of it that I don't look back at that experience with shame. I don't look back and look badly at him, because to the last question, he and I were the same. He and I were both angry. He and I were both abandoned. We chose different coping mechanisms. One was got lots of applause and ended up at USC, and his coping mechanism didn't. Very different. But was it born of the same pain? That's why I think this perspective that we have, cherish that, right? Because that's your empathy. I'm going to ask them a question really quick before we go to the next question, because I'm actually really curious with this group, the answer. I kind of think I already know. How many of you, since you've been at USC, since you've been on this campus, have had the thought, God, I wish my family, raise your hand, my family, my best friend from home, my brother, my sister, were here. I wish they could experience this. Don't be shy. Raise your hand if you thought about the people you love while you've been here. Okay, so it's probably the majority of the room. If you raised your hand, that means you have empathy. That means you're a good human. That means you remember where you came from. You remember the people who you come from. And you take them into these spaces with you, right? That's beautiful. Not only is it a good human though, but that's actually one of the biggest skills you have as a professional. Because whether you work in business or healthcare, no matter what you do, you know, they say where you come from, don't forget where you come from. Where you come from doesn't let you forget. Okay? So if it's not going to let you forget, what are you going to do with that?
Good questions, but that just made me think when we were talking.
You can't steal another question. This is their time.
This is not a question, it's a comment, and I'm a professor, so I can make it. So that we were talking at lunch, there's a very famous line from Jesse Jackson's speech at a Democratic convention when he ran for the presidency that you see the house I'm running for, you don't see the house I'm running from. And reconciling that is an important part of our journeys. Questions from the students in particular? Don't be shy.
Who has a question before I call
There's a-
by name?
There's a hand right there.
Oh, wonderful.
I had a question. You talked about being true with yourself. And pretty much I want to know, like, how did you overcome the fear to be able to tell your story to others?
Can you give us your name as well?
Yeah, my name is Stephanie.
Stephanie, okay.
Well, I think that experience when I was younger really helped. But I understand that I have a unique threshold for being vulnerable to write a book. And it doesn't mean you have to write a book in order to be vulnerable or be in this way. For some of us, it's admitting it to our close circle. For some of us, it's integrating it into our perspective at work, you know. But it's complicated because, as we know, and as you know from my book, my story is intertwined with other people's stories. And that's what people share with me a lot, that when they talk about their story, they're talking about their parents' stories, their mom's stories, their abuelita's stories, their cousin's stories, you know, and how much courage does it take and responsibility and guilt do you feel telling some stories of other folks? And I'll share a story as an answer to your question, which is, you know, when I was giving one of the first talks that I ever gave at the LA Public Library when the book came out, it was interesting because it was the first time that my mom was coming to hear me talk. And when I was writing the book, you know, I tell some pretty personal stories about my mother in it. You know, pretty vulnerable. Talk about your vulnerability, and then vulnerability with your family within your story's vulnerability, right? So I had called my mom over to, you know, share the story with her before I finalized the manuscript, because it was important to me. You know, no one's trying to shame our families. This isn't about blaming our families. This is about telling the truth about our experience, right? But it's different than trying to hurt people, right? And I read her this, and it was very activating for both of us. And I could tell, you know, it wasn't the most comfortable for her because, especially generationally, a lot of our parents don't share these things. These are stories that are kept in dark closets and with lids, right? And so she didn't ask me to change anything, thankfully. She said, well, it's the truth, you know? But, you know, you can tell it's complicated. So fast forward, I'm at LA Public Library, and I'm sitting, it's like the big stadium, right, and there. And she sits like right where you are, sir, like right in front of me, like directly in my eye line while I'm talking about all these things. And today, you know, we got into a fraction of the stories, but if you know the book, you know, there's a lot in that book, right? And I felt kind of uncomfortable, you know, about that part of the vulnerability, because one part is the vulnerability of yourself. It's a different level. But then when we started asking questions and taking questions, everyone who would ask a question would cry. And it's very natural for this conversation to bring up tears if anyone feels emotional in this. I mean, how could you not feel it? I've been talking about it for 2 years and I still cry sometimes talking about it. So that's totally natural, and I actually think is a show of strength, right? But everyone started crying. And I noticed my mom noticing the tears, And she called me the next morning and she said, I want you to know that I get it now. I understand why you shared your story, and I understand why you shared my story. And she said, I think this might be healing for me too. And so I'm not trying to put a big, pretty Disneyland bow on it, because I know that it could go very different than that too, right? But what I am trying to say is you don't realize for the first and onlys that your family, your loved ones are watching. They may not be acknowledging it yet. They may not be like, thanks for, being a trailblazer and changing everything. They may be criticizing you, right? It may be like, why are you never home anymore? Do you think you're better than everyone else now? Like, it can look a lot of ways. And they are watching, right? It took me until my 40s to really understand that. But just know from my perspective that even though it's not your responsibility to heal everyone, okay, and we can talk about that for a whole day if we had it, right? And sometimes what you do has ripples. Forward in time, but back too. And I think the back one is really fascinating.
I just want to give a reminder, thank you so much for that if you are a little bit shy and don't want to ask a question, you can submit a question on menti.com right here. And also a quick shout out, because we do have your mom in the audience.
Yeah, I don't want to embarrass her, but yeah, she's just back there.
Let's give her a round of applause.
I think I saw a hand shooting up over there.
Oh, there's two.
There's two.
Okay, great. Here we go.
Hey, you guys always warm up after a few minutes.
And please say your name when you ask the question if you're comfortable.
Hello, my name is Lena, and I was just wondering if the action of writing and editing and having to add chapters and all of these parts of writing a book gave you a special context about not only the first gen experience, but just the different phases in your life that it took to get to where you are.
Absolutely. Writing a memoir, I don't know if anyone here is interested in writing or maybe thinks one day they'd write a memoir, and it's a very unique experience. First of all, I wear an Oura ring, kind of like an Apple Watch on your finger. And I've started noticing that when I would be writing, sitting in a chair, not doing anything crazy, my heart rate would just zoom, right? And if I wrote past 3 p.m. in my writing practice, I would have insomnia, like anxiety-based insomnia that night, right? And anxiety is not something that I deal with anymore. I know we talked a little bit about that, and I found tools, and I found a great therapist, and it wasn't something active for my life anymore. But when I went into these places, in order to write a book, you're not writing, again, like a documentary. You got to go back into these memories, and it was, very activating, all of that experience. And it was also very eye-opening. I was sharing actually earlier with Manuel that there's this old movie in the 80s. Now you guys are definitely not going to know about it. Unless you're into cult films. Who ever heard of a movie called The Never-Ending Story? That's really impressive, guys. Yeah, okay, I see you over there. Okay, so The Never-Ending Story, just think of a Lord of the Rings, right? In the 80s, it's a hero's journey. And this guy, the main character, he has to follow all these tests, pass all these tests to get to the end. And when he gets to the test, it's called the wall or the Hall of Mirrors. And in the Hall of Mirrors, the reason why it's the hardest test you can do is because you have to face your true nature when you look in that mirror. So men who think they're heroes find out they're cowards. Men who think they're powerful find out they're weak. All these ways that we have to look at ourselves. And I was sharing earlier was that writing a book is like that. And that's why it's so exposing, but that's why it's also so transforming, is that screen, that blank blinking screen is your wall of mirrors, right? When you sit there in front of it, you see all your stuff, the stories you tell yourself, the doubts, the stories other people have told you about yourself, right? All those things come up. And in order to write every day, you have to come above them. So that alone, regardless of what you write after that, that alone is a success. So whenever you sit there in your creativity process and you just start writing, know that you've already passed that test.
We're going to pick up one more question, then we'll close because we like to end on time. I think there's a hand up there, maybe 2 more questions.
Sorry, guys. I'll answer really fast so we can get their question.
Bring her really quick.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Mauricio. Kind of curious to hear, how have you seen the person-only experience change from like the 90s to now? Have you noticed any changes?
What a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. All great questions. Well, first of all, we didn't have language for it. When I was wearing the same USC sweatshirt as you, I actually had yours. We didn't have language for it. And as you know, when I was here at USC and ended up rushing right before school even started, I didn't even know what sororities or fraternities were. And my mom actually found it because I was commuting my first year and I had no place to go and I was having all these panic attacks. And my mom was like, I just heard about this thing, you should do this thing, you know? So, you know, I was surviving how I could without having any language for what this experience was. And then now I go to these campuses and there's these programs, there's these incredible centers, there's this incredible language for this experience. Now that doesn't make the experience itself any easier, let's be real, because when I hear the questions from the students, there's a reason why they go, I hear from a 16-year-old guy in Chicago saying, oh my God, your story's like my story. So how is a 16-year-old guy in Chicago, how is my story like his story, right? That tells me that the emotional impact of some of these things continues to be the same. But how incredible that there's programs, whether it's the TRIO programs, whether it's the first gen centers, whether it's ABC, right? And even the nonprofit that I created that I'm trying to continue to grow. There's programs out there to at least name it, right, and support. But that doesn't mean, again, that it's somehow we're all gonna survive this and not feel it. Okay, I'll go really fast.
We could pick up one more question over here. I think there was a hand.
Who else had their hand up over here?
Okay, there you go.
Oh, Flor? Okay. Can you pass that back to her?
Looks like a double question.
So as someone who's first gen, I know there's like many layers to our story. So after writing and publishing it, and now 2 years after, do you think you missed anything or something you would change or add to the book?
That's a great question too. Well, I'll give you a couple things. There's only like 2 things that come to mind, and I'm thankful about that I don't sit here with all these regrets, because if you know me at all from this book, you know that I do not like regret. I rather fail than have regret, which is why I took a lot of these gambles and why this risk-taking, which I wish we had another hour to talk about the risk-taking part of this, why that calculated risk is so important, and having to face your appetite for risk versus regret being such a great way to figure out what you can live with in your life, right, when you're making these choices. So I'm intentional about not having regret. And I don't know if I use the word regret, but there was another chapter to the spider story I told you, and I left it out because I was told, oh, you know, people won't care. It's not relevant to the larger story. And, you know, I get asked a lot, right? So all I'll say is there will be an opportunity to share that last chapter with you at some point. That's all I'm going to say. But the only other thing that I thought about is because, you know, I remember in the breakaway guilt chapter, maybe this is a good way to end anyway, because this is one of the components of the Trailblazer Toll that really has legs. And I know you guys are already feeling some of it now, but the more you achieve in your lives, and I have no doubt that all of you will achieve so many things, the larger that chasm gets, right? You start making more money than your family members. You start making more money maybe than your parents. You start having access to opportunities that are so different, right? You end up in ballrooms and White Houses and boardrooms, and you know that why sometimes I hear from folks saying, you know, I get to these achievement moments and I feel bad. Right? I feel guilty. I get to the vacation and I feel like I shouldn't be there. I write about how when I was graduating from Harvard and I received long stem roses, all I could think about was how much they cost, right? And so those moments, those ones have legs certainly, and I have lots of examples from present day about all of that. And that chapter about breakaway guilt, and that's why I didn't end the book at the White House, was intentional. I ended the book after, when I came home. Because it doesn't end when you reach that moment. It ends when you go full circle and you have to come home and realize that maybe your life is the only one that's really materially changed, right? And so there was a moment in the book, if you remember, I was having a Thanksgiving dinner. And you know, I was there and I got really upset, you know, kind of realizing all of these things about the breakaway guilt, and I kind of went into the bathroom to kind of collect myself because no one was asking me any questions, and I felt like just there was a lack of interest, right? And I didn't include that what happened was then my mom came into the bathroom and she said, oh no, don't worry, you know, your aunt worked really hard to get today, you know, perfect. You know, she pawned her jewelry to pay for the turkey. And how just tears, right? And I could feel your reaction was the same as mine, right? And I had forgotten about that, and we remembered together after the fact. And I wish I had put that in there because I think that paints that picture really perfectly for us about what that feels like. And she quickly told me, don't worry, as soon as she gets her tax return back, she's gonna pay it, bring them back. She's gonna go buy them back when she gets her tax return. Which I realized, by the way, as an adult, that tax time, I used to think that's always when you got money. And then I started realizing as you get older, you're like, oh, you know, it was when we waited for the return, right? So I wish I had put that in just because I think it was a truth, and it also was a good illustration. But yeah, you know, that guilt, it doesn't have to be this albatross on our shoulders, around our neck always, right? And I know that it's something that we feel, but it doesn't have to be something that is debilitating because, again, it's a larger conversation, but there are ways that we can show up. There are ways that we can pour into our families, but that balance is complicated. I don't want to leave us on a bad note.
No, we're going to be leaving on a good note, and I'll tell you why. First, we're going to end just because of it, and we will end with thunderous applause in just 1 second. But before we do, there are both books for sale and books that are for free, and I do not completely understand this. So, Lauren, can you please talk about Book Lollapalooza, which is happening out there? And then
Sure.
I will close us.
Yeah, so we gave away books. I believe we had about 37. I believe they're all gone. But we have books available for purchase at the registration table. And then there's this first gen group that is going to be raffling off 3 copies, but that information will come in our thank you email that we'll send after the event. So just keep an eye out for that. So we have more opportunities if you don't have one.
Thank you. And Alejandra will be around to sign books as well. And you know, the last question I was going to ask you, which will be
I love it. I'll stay here all day, guys. Let's go.
we can do this quickly, because I actually have an answer to it as well, which I was going to ask you, what's bringing you joy these days? And I've got to say, one thing that's bringing me joy is this conversation. It's always been good to get to know you better, to have read the book, and to be not a 16-year-old guy in Chicago, but a 69-year-old Latino in LA. And to see myself in your book, that level of communication just is giving me joy. What is giving you joy, so we can give you the joy of a thunderous applause?
Well, first of all, this conversation, because you're someone I deeply, deeply respect, and I know I'm not alone in that, and this has been so joyful to have this conversation. Can we actually give him a thunderous applause first? And what brings me joy, again, has to go full circle, honestly, is being here with all of you. Because even the folks that that I've made eye contact with, I can tell are feeling emotion. Even the folks that I know are in it right now. Even the folks that I know are looking back and having some memories right now. We're all in this together. And I get to be with you, and I hope that helps you feel less alone. But I get to feel less alone too, right? We all do. I don't know if you guys feel it like I do, but there's a beautiful energy in this room. This isn't like a book talk, right? This is that connective tissue I was talking about. So thank you for giving me your energy, because I feel it, I receive it. And thank you for receiving mine, because I know that this book, the reading of it, is a vulnerable thing to let that in, right? And I hope you know that I respect that and feel honored that you would share me with your students that I know how much you all are protective of. So I'm honored to be here with all of you. I'm rooting for all of you. And if anyone had a question that was super personal and you did not want to share it or ask it in front of cameras and other people, I'm in my DMs. So just send me a message. I really am. So send me a message, and I'm happy to respond. So thank you.
Let's get loud.